The morning the first letter arrived, the fog over Baker Street was thick like wool, making even the lamplighter's shape blurry. I was reading quietly by the fireplace, when Holmes, with a quick flick of his wrist that always showed he was secretly excited, broke the seal of a small white envelope. The handwriting was light, as if drawn by a shaking hand, but it was clearly real. Inside was a single sheet of fancy paper, with only one line written on it. "You failed me once, Mr. Holmes. Do not fail me again." There was no name signed, and no address, only the faint smell of sea salt and rotting roses. Holmes's eyes narrowed. The black parts of his eyes got smaller, like the opening of a camera focusing on something no one could see. "Watson," he whispered, "the dead have started a habit of writing letters." And with that, the quiet peace of our home disappeared into a fear that even the happy clatter of the milk cart could not chase away. A dark London was waking up outside the curtains. Fog filled the streets, carriage wheels ground on the roads, and there was a faint hum from a city pretending not to think of its ghosts. If you are as curious about these forgotten voices as I was that day, then stay with us. Subscribe, share the mystery, and keep the lamps of Baker Street burning, because what comes next is not a normal investigation, but a deep dive into letters written by hands that have long been still. It was one of those London mornings when the air itself seemed to harden into something you could touch, thick, colorless, and a little like metal. The fog pressed against the window panes like the breath of some giant, unseen creature, and the dull rumble of carriages below seemed to rise not from wheels, but from the very bones of the city. I had decided to have a quiet breakfast, the newspaper folded beside my teacup, when Holmes stirred from his chair with the sudden life of a dog catching a smell. He had been silent for hours, his long fingertips touching, his eyes fixed on the ceiling in that strange daze that often announced a new idea was being born. Without a word he rose, crossed the room in 2 steps, and got the morning mail from the table. I watched him casually as he flicked through the envelopes, his manner uninterested until his hand paused on one. A small white envelope, not special at first glance, but for the strange paleness of its paper, as though it had been bleached by the sea. Holmes's eyebrows drew together. "Curious," he murmured. "The handwriting shakes, yet every curve follows a careful hand. Watson, look. See how the line going down on the H presses deeper than the rest. There is strength here, but it is a weakening strength." I leaned forward. The address read simply, "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, 221B Baker Street, London." No date, no return mark, no decoration of any kind, only the faintest feeling of salt on the paper. Holmes got his magnifying glass and examined the seal. Sea salt, as I suspected, and the wax. A mixture not often used since the turn of the century. Whoever sent this letter wants to seem like they are from another time. He broke the seal carefully, and as the flap came free, a faint smell reached us. Not perfume and not rot, but something between the two, the scent of wilted roses left too long in water. The letter inside was written in faded ink on a thin sheet of fancy paper. Holmes read it once silently, then again out loud. "You failed me once, Mr. Holmes. Do not fail me again." No signature, no clue where it came from. Yet even before I could speak, I saw the change in my friend. His eyes, those sharp gray lanterns of his mind, lit up with a strange fire, a light not of discovery, but of remembering. "You recognize the writing?" I asked. "I do," he said quietly, and for the shortest moment, I thought I saw his calmness shake. Or rather, I recognize what it pretends to be. This, Watson, is the handwriting of a man who has been dead for 7 years. The words hung in the still air like the ringing of a bell. "You cannot mean ... I mean exactly what I say." The ink fades. The style changes with age. But the rhythm of the pen, The flow of the writing is unmistakable. This was written to look like the writing of Captain Elias Gower, late of the ship Argonaut, who drowned off the coast of Dover in '83. I remembered the name faintly, because Gower had been the subject of one of Holmes's earliest cases. A matter about fake shipping lists and a fire that was never explained at the East India docks. The case had ended suddenly, and the truth was never fully told, even to me. But Holmes, I said, if the man died at sea, then either the sea has learned to write, or, he interrupted, someone on land wants me to believe it has. He paced to the window, his shape blurry from the mist outside. Look, Watson, how the fog thickens whenever the city hides something shameful. London works together with its secrets. He stood there a moment, looking into that milky emptiness, then turned back, every line of his face sharpened with decision. We shall begin at the post office. No ordinary clerk would have accepted a letter with no date like this one. It must have been delivered by hand. Within the hour, we were rattling through the streets in a horse-drawn cab, the horse's hooves striking hollow notes on the stones. The city lay half-dreaming in its own mist, with street lamps casting halos through the murk like underwater suns. Holmes sat forward, his gloved hands clasped, every nerve alive. Watson, he said suddenly, when we reach the district office on Wigmore Street, watch the clerks. Guilty people seldom look directly at what they fear, and remember, the smallest hesitation may reveal more than a confession. At the post office, Holmes showed the envelope with that strange mix of politeness and authority, which made even the most stubborn workers give in. The clerk looked at it with professional boredom, until Holmes's gaze, steady and unblinking, seemed to pull from him the one truth he had not wanted to say. It was brought by a man, sir, the clerk admitted. Tall, thin, dressed in funeral black. Said it was urgent. Left no name. Did he speak? Not a word. But he smelled of sea air, if I may say so. Holmes tilted his head. Thank you. You have been most observant. As we stepped back into the chill, he said in a low voice, a man dressed for a funeral who smells of the sea and delivers letters from the dead. The drama of it is almost too much. We are meant to follow. Then it is a trap. Every mystery is a trap, Watson, until we learn who set it. We ate dinner late that evening, though Holmes barely touched his food. He sat at the table with the letter before him, tracing its edges as though measuring the weight of the unknown. I had seen him like this before, the stillness that comes before the storm. At last he spoke. The wording is deliberate. You failed me once. Only one man ever accused me of that, and that man's body was never found. Gower's ship sank within sight of land. The current may have carried him somewhere else. I was startled. You believe he is alive? I believe, he replied, that belief itself is the tool of this plan. Whether the hand that wrote this belongs to Gower or to his ghost, it wants me to feel the same unease. And it is working. He rose suddenly, got his violin, and began to play a low, restless tune that drifted like smoke through the room. The music swayed between sounding right and sounding wrong, as though the bow itself doubted the truth of the notes. Watson, he said between phrases, do you remember how the Argonaut was reported lost? Fire at sea. No survivors. Ah, but the cargo list was kept secret. There were rumors, not proven, that the ship carried not goods but letters taken from the Navy's record office. Letters that could have ruined reputations if they were revealed. And now, I said slowly, one such letter finds its way to you. Precisely. He set down the violin. Someone wants to reopen a grave long buried in both earth and conscience. The wind rose outside, rattling the windows like distant applause. Holmes stood motionless in the flickering firelight, his profile carved in shadow and flame. If the dead truly write, Watson, he murmured, then London is about to become their post office. He turned to me then, the faintest smile at the corner of his mouth, half amused, half defiant. Tomorrow we visit the docks. The sea keeps better records than Scotland Yard. I could think of nothing more fitting to say than to nod. The letter still lay on the table, pale against the dark wood, the single sentence on it gleaming faintly in the lamplight, like a wound that refused to close. Outside the fog deepened, swallowing the lamps one by one until only the faint glow of our window remained. A lonely star, adrift in the vast gray silence of the city. And somewhere in that silence, I thought I heard the faint echo of a voice. Whether it was memory or imagination, I could not tell, whispering, "You failed me once." Holmes put out the lamp, and we stood a moment in the dark, listening to the heartbeat of London, steady and mysterious. Whatever lay ahead had already begun to move toward us through the fog. "Come, Watson," he said softly. "The game has written its first letter." Holmes kept watch over the white envelope, as though it were a patient holding on by a single faint breath. He burned a candle to ash and another to a crooked wick, bending near enough to the paper that the flame threw a shaking halo on his face. I prepared the small heater and set out his little row of bottles. Oxalic acid, diluted hydrochloric acid, a brown solution of galls, until our sitting room might have looked like the corner of a small laboratory. "If the letter is a trap," he said, "we must find out for what beast we are bait." He slipped the fancy paper under his lens, then under the light, then into a shallow dish, so that a layer of pure water touched its edges and released, with almost improper closeness, the secrets trapped in its fibers. "Look at these crystals," he murmured. "Sodium chloride and magnesium sulfate in a ratio too high for London fog, too low for the open sea. Harbor water, Watson, a river mixture. Someone let this sheet drink from the Thames, and then dried it among roses. A chemical puzzle of drama and truth. And the ink, iron gall, as was common, yet mixed with a little bit of Prussian blue, a draftsman's ink, loved by men who look at charts." He tilted the sheet. "Do you see the faint watermark here? Hold the lamp steady." With careful fingers, he drew the paper over the dark mouth of a glass beaker, the better to show the faint symbol pressed inside. At first, I saw nothing. Then, as the flame wavered, a design floated up from being invisible, a dirty anchor circled by a narrow laurel, and beneath it a tiny message I could hardly believe. "Admiralty Reserve," Holmes read. And below that, the papermaker's mark, Whatman, Turkey Mill, made years ago, yet saved for special uses. Our letter, my dear fellow, was torn from a sheet meant for official Navy letters. I felt a chill that was not entirely from the drafty window. Then the rumor you spoke of, the Argonaut carrying stolen letters, ... Holmes gave the briefest nod. A rumor I discouraged at the time. Truth, if such a thing can be said to exist in society, was a luxury we could not afford. A certain gentleman with power no names, Watson preferred a loss at sea to a scandal on land. I agreed to be silent because I believed the main villain was dead, and because need was made to wear the mask of honor. The corner of his mouth tightened. In that light, his face seemed carved from regret. He shook off the mood like a dog sheds rain. With tweezers he lifted a feathery thread from the envelope's inside, no more than a hint of a plant, then moved it to a glass slide. "Reed grass," he declared after a glance, "common along the river banks near Blackwall and Rotherhithe. But here's the stranger clue." He tapped the paper where the fold was. A dusting of paler grains stuck to his fingertip. Kaolin pipe clay. Not the ordinary white smear of a street bricklayer, but the finer clay used to dust envelopes in certain offices to prevent sticking. The practice went out of use years ago. Only the older businesses keep doing it. He reached for the directory on the mantelpiece and opened it somewhere in the middle, as if the page had been waiting. Hobbs and Wainwright, paper sellers to the Navy, the Strand. The Strand is long, I noted. Yet habit is short, he said, already reaching for his coat. Men trained in one hallway seldom wander far from it. Come, Watson, let us ask the Strand what it has been whispering. We took a cab and clip-clopped through the dull day. The driver cursed at the fog, then cursed again with fondness when his horse found its footing. London men often swear at what they love. When at last we got out, the Strand announced itself by the crowd of people and the flash of wet cobblestones under the lamplight. Hobbs and Wainwright turned out to be a narrow-fronted shop between a print seller with a window full of shocking cartoons and a tobacco seller whose jars shone like dull planets. A bell tinkled as we entered, and a smell of paper, glue, and old ink rose to us with a schoolboy's seriousness. A gentleman with a stooped dignity came forward, his fingers permanently stained with blue. "May I be of service, gentlemen?" Holmes showed him the envelope, and nothing more. The man's eyes pricked with the possessive pride of a craftsman recognizing his own work. "Yes," he said, after a careful pause. "We dust with a selected pipe clay. A survival, you might say. My late partner swore by it." He looked more closely. "The cut of the flap also has our mark. This is ours, sir. But how it left us?" "By purchase," Holmes suggested. The paper seller's mouth made a regretful bud. "Not in these exact sizes. This is a trimming of a larger Admiralty sheet. We keep a stock under lock, only for specific orders. From offices with the anchor mark," Holmes finished, laying the paper flat. "A quiet buyer, no doubt, tall, in funeral black, silent." Recognition wavered in the man's eyes like a fish under a surface. One does not recall faces at all times. Holmes did not push him. "You sent a large amount to which office last?" "Blackfriars," the man said before he could stop himself. "To a small side office where the Navy keeps a collection of letters recovered from shipwrecks. A sad business, sir, sorting last words addressed to ladies who long since dried their tears." "Blackfriars," Holmes repeated softly, and in that repetition I heard a bell ring. We left with a politeness that was partly out of pity. In the cab, Holmes's attention returned to the letter as if it could still confess. "Admiralty Reserve, Blackfriars Annex," he said. "The past has not drowned. It has been filed. Where a clerk files, a thief studies." He fell into silence, which was broken only when the cab slowed near Ludgate Hill, and the black back of the river showed itself between buildings like a beast's side. "Holmes," I said, forced by a sudden memory, "you spoke of a gentleman whose power weighed on the Argonaut affair. Was Captain Gower his helper or his enemy?" Holmes's glance toward me was quick and cool. "An enemy, in the way that a conscience is an enemy," he said. "A decent man placed in an indecent closeness to power. He wrote letters, Watson, letters which, had they arrived, would have burned more reputations than a warehouse fire has bundles of cloth," he added in a tone more to himself. "I thought him dead, and perhaps I needed him to be. It is the one assumption now being punished." The Blackfriars Annex, when we found it, hid behind an unlovely brick wall whose dampness had grown a map of sickly spots. A brass plate, "Admiralty Correspondence, recovered and miscellaneous," had dulled to the color of the river on a gloomy afternoon. Inside, a clerk led us to a reading room, where cabinets towered with a modesty that almost made one overlook their size. Names had been tamed into labels. Fate had been divided into drawers. A woman waited for us there, accidental in her authority. She wore a black dress fastened to the throat and a silver ring that outshone it. "Mrs. Armitage," she said, offering no friendly greetings. "I keep the keys and the quiet. You, sir, must be Mr. Holmes. We have had reason to bless and curse your name." Holmes tilted his head as one takes a holy wafer. "Madam," I come to ask only about a specific paper. You received a request, or a theft, concerning Admiralty Reserve sheets. Watman. Turkey Mill. We have received everything except peace, Mrs. Armitage replied. 2 weeks ago, a man showed a letter of authority, excellent, if fake, and left with 3 packets. We discovered the forgery when the real officer arrived later the same day. A hat left behind was our only clue. A hat, Holmes repeated with the faintest lift of interest. Mrs. Armitage produced it from a drawer. A tall, narrow felt of the kind worn by undertakers. Dignified sadness squeezed into a hat. The inner band was creased with the curve of a thin head. Holmes drew out a pinched thread from the lining. Salt stiffened and brought it to his tongue with the absent-minded daring that would have shocked anyone but me. "River's breath," he said, and a smear here of red wax, pressed on and lost. He turned the hat's band to the light until an oval of leftover wax caught in it, too faint for an unprepared eye. I made out a design, a small hooded figure with crossed hands. A friar. Black friars, I breathed. A childish, punning pride, Holmes said, though a glimmer of appreciation warmed his voice. A thief who cannot resist leaving his joke on the world will one day laugh himself into the noose. Mrs. Armitage looked at us with a steadiness I admired. If this man returns, shall I send for Scotland Yard? Send for Inspector Lestrade, Holmes replied, and send also a telegram to me at Baker Street. But he will not return by the door he entered. He set the hat on the table, as one sets a decoy on water. He will come by the river. We stepped back into the afternoon and its well-practiced sadness. A gull circled with a cry that the fog swallowed like a secret. Holmes's walk had gotten that spring, which means some connection has suddenly leaped across a gap. "You have it," I said. "I have the beginning of its shape." His eyes were on the river, whose surface moved without seeming to go anywhere. Consider the facts. Fake authority, true knowledge of an old practice, the purchase of funeral clothes as a costume, the use of a church-related pun to spice up the story. This is a man to whom death is not just a fact, but a language. He writes with it. He disguises himself in it. He enjoys its spotlight. A resurrection man, I suggested. An expert on remains, Holmes allowed. Perhaps he once handled the dead and discovered the living were more easily arranged. He lifted his face to the damp air. If he wishes to conduct his show at Blackfriars, we will attend his performance. We walked along the riverbank with hats pulled low and collars up. The river stirred, shouldering barges the way a sleeper shifts in a hard bed. A boy ran past with a penny whistle. 2 men argued in the tough dialect of the dockworkers. Every sound was ordinary. Together they became a sign. Holmes paused on the crown of the bridge and leaned on the stone, his head a little bowed as though he were a pilgrim come to ask the water for something. "Captain Elias Gower," he said, and the name left his lips with the weariness of an oath. The name that should not be written is finally cleared. He straightened. "Watson, we shall keep watch here tonight." If our undertaker with his fancy letters plans his next delivery, he will choose an hour when the world mistakes movement for the tide. And if he does not come? Holmes's smile had iron in it. He will come, for men who make puns are slaves to timing. He looked once more at the slow black run of the Thames. The dead are on time when called by pride. The light faded simply, and the lamps along the bridge awoke like cautious eyes. London began its nightly routine. Wheels, whistles, the clack of boots, a chorus threaded on fog. Somewhere in that great distance, a bell tolled the hour with a tone that looked backwards. Holmes and I did not speak. We took our positions in the shadow of a pier, wrapped in the dampness of stone and patience. The river, which had watched empires with plain indifference, prepared to watch us. The first soft splash came exactly when the bell stopped shaking. The fog that night seemed almost alive. It rolled from the river in dense, shiny folds, coiling around the bridge like a living thing protecting its home. Gas lamps glowed faintly through the haze, their halos dimmed to pale coins. Holmes and I waited under one of the great arches of Blackfriars Bridge, half hidden in shadow, our breath steaming faintly in the air. The hour had passed midnight, and the city, though asleep above us, murmured in its sleep the dull pulse of distant hooves, the whisper of water lapping against stone, the occasional clatter of a watchman's club against the pavement. Holmes crouched beside me, the collar of his overcoat turned high. "You see, Watson," he whispered, "the river does not hide. It reveals. It carries back what men try to bury." He pointed toward the slow, oily current. "If our letter writer means to stage another act, the Thames is his theater, and we are his only audience." We waited in silence. From the shadow of a mooring post, Holmes drew out his pocket watch and glanced at the time. 1 o'clock, he murmured. He is on time, as all self-centered people are. Moments later, a faint sound broke the sameness of the tide, a measured scrape, metal on stone, as though something heavy were being dragged along the wharf. Holmes stiffened. "There," he breathed. "Do you hear it?" I nodded. Through the fog, a figure appeared on the bridge above us, a man of tall and sharp-angled frame, clothed in black from hat to boots. He moved with deliberate care, pausing often to glance behind him. In one hand, he carried a leather case. In the other, a walking stick that gleamed faintly in the dim light. He reached the railing, rested the case on it, and for a moment simply stood there, looking down into the darkness below. Then, without hesitation, he lifted the case and let it fall. It struck the water with a quiet splash. Holmes was already moving, his thin figure melting into the fog as though it had been waiting for the cue. I followed at once, my boots slipping on the damp stone as we climbed the narrow stairway to the top of the bridge. By the time we reached the railing, the man was gone. Only the faint echo of retreating footsteps lingered toward the south end, swallowed quickly by the mist. Holmes leaned over the low wall, scanning the black water. "Too swift a fall for any ordinary package," he muttered. "Weighted, perhaps." Then, turning sharply, "Come, Watson, downstream. The current will carry it no more than a few yards." We went down again to the riverbank and found the water churning faintly near one of the posts. Holmes produced a small hook and cord from his pocket, a tool I had long since stopped being surprised by, and cast it into the current. After several careful sweeps, the hook caught something solid. Together we dragged it toward the shore, a small iron-banded box, heavy and cold. Its surface was slick with river slime, its clasp sealed with red wax. Holmes knelt beside it, examining the seal by lamplight. "The wax has the same mark as before, a hooded friar with folded hands. Our undertaker enjoys being consistent," he murmured. "And pride, once again. Shall we open it here?" I asked. "In this light? No, the night hides enough without our help. We shall take it home." It was near 2 o'clock when we reached Baker Street once more. Mrs. Hudson, half-dressed and shocked, met us at the door, but Holmes brushed past her apologies. He carried the box as though it were a baby of delicate health, setting it down on the table with great care. "Now, Watson," he said, producing a penknife, "let us see what ghosts deliver their mail so carefully." He broke the wax seal and lifted the lid. Inside lay a layer of rough linen, damp and smelly with the odor of the river. Under it rested several envelopes, identical in color and paper to the first, but tied together with a thin strand of black thread. Holmes's hand hovered for a moment before he untied them. 5 letters, he said, each addressed to me, each postmarked with a date that should not exist. I frowned. "What do you mean?" He handed me one of the envelopes. The stamp had the mark of the General Post Office, dated the 17th of June, 1883. But that, Holmes said quietly, was the day the Argonaut burned and sank. He slit one open with surgical precision. The handwriting was the same faint, unsteady writing, Captain Gowers, but the words were stranger still. Holmes, your logic burns brighter than mercy. The fire was not an accident. They drowned us on purpose. Seek the widow who weeps for no one, and you will find the man who sent the sea to do his work. Holmes read it twice, then placed it aside. He writes in riddles or code. Either way, he points us toward a living witness. He opened the second letter. The river keeps its debts, though men forget what they owe. The fifth name was never written, yet it commands the rest. He folded it gently, as though handling a holy object. There is a pattern here, Watson. See, 5 letters, 5 messages, 5 years of silence. He speaks of a circle, debts, names, an unfinished score to settle. And the widow? I asked. Holmes's gaze drifted toward the fire. If she weeps for no one, then her grief is either fake or long gone. We must find her. He replaced the letters in the box and leaned back, his expression half lit by the lamplight. Blackfriars Bridge, the Admiralty paper, the undertaker's clothes, all threads of the same cloth. But who is the weaver? And why now, after so many years? For the first time since I'd known him, I sensed a shadow of unease in him. Not fear Holmes did not fear, but a rare understanding that smarts alone might not be enough. There are cases, he said slowly, where the mind becomes too sharp and cuts the hand that holds it. Outside, the first hint of dawn began to pale the fog. London reawakened with its tired music. The call of a newsboy, the rattle of a milk cart, the sigh of steam from distant engines. Holmes watched it through the window, the box beside him on the table. The dead right, Watson, he murmured, but they choose their messengers from among the living. Find me the widow who does not weep, and perhaps I shall learn which of them still walks. He turned from the window, the firelight reflected in his eyes like 2 tiny coals. Dress warmly. We shall call on Gower's church records before the morning papers begin their guesses. I would prefer to meet the truth before it reaches print. As I gathered my coat, I glanced again at the letters lying open on the table. The ink had begun to bleed faintly into the paper, as though the words themselves were dissolving back into the water for which they came. One phrase, still readable in the growing light, seemed to breathe even as I read it. The fifth name was never written. Holmes, I said softly, what do you suppose that means? He smiled, a thin, unreadable, almost kind smile. It means, my dear Watson, that the list is not yet complete. And with that, we stepped once more into the graying dawn, not knowing that the city itself was about to open a door it had long pretended was locked. By midday, the fog had thinned to a colorless veil, the kind that dims the sun without hiding it. Baker Street stirred with its usual hum, carriages clattering over cobblestones, newsboys crying about scandals in the Empire, and the faint brass cry of an organ grinder 2 streets away. Yet inside our rooms, the mood was tense, held tight by silence. The letters from the river lay on Holmes's desk, pressed flat under a glass weight, their ink faintly gleaming where the morning light touched them. He had not spoken for nearly an hour, but I could tell that his mind was spinning through unseen circles. At last he rose, snatched his violin from its case, and drew from it a low, restless tune that trembled between sounding wrong and sounding right. A widow who weeps for no one, he said suddenly, still playing. An odd riddle, Watson. Either her heart is empty, or her guilt is full. He set the instrument aside. I have checked the church records. Captain Elias Gower was from Deptford. His last known address was number 13 Gower Street. A name, you see, which fate enjoys repeating. His wife, Mrs. Clara Gower, was declared a widow 7 years ago, and now lives in rented rooms off the same street. She has never remarried. It is to her we shall pay our respects. We arrived at the address shortly after 2 o'clock. The house was a narrow, tired building, its bricks stained with soot, and its windows covered with muslin curtains yellowed by gaslight. A brass plate by the door read, "Mrs. Halter, Rooms to Let." Holmes pressed the bell, and we were let in by a woman whose small eyes darted between us like little fish in shallow water. She smelled of starch and suspicion. "Yes, gentlemen? If it's rooms you want ... On the contrary," Holmes interrupted with polite firmness. "We are looking for one of your tenants, Mrs. Clara Gower." The landlady hesitated. "She doesn't often have visitors." "All the more reason she should see us," Holmes replied, and before she could object, he slipped a visiting card into her hand. Whatever she saw on it was enough. She led us upstairs with unwilling politeness. The third-floor landing was stuffy and airless, thick with the scent of mothballs and old carpets. At the end of the hallway stood a single door, its paint blistered by years of neglect. The landlady knocked, and after a pause, a woman's voice answered, calm, low, and oddly strong. "Who is it?" "Visitors for you, madam." "Gentlemen from Baker Street." A silence, and the click of a bolt being undone. The door opened just wide enough to let us in. Mrs. Clara Gower was not the sad, crying figure I had imagined. She was tall, thin, and perfectly dressed in black, though her clothes showed the polish of care rather than wealth. Her hair, once fair, had faded to a pale ash. There were lines around her eyes, but not the kind drawn by tears, but rather by long, sleepless thinking. She looked at Holmes with a calmness that was almost defiant. "I know who you are," she said, "and I know why you've come." Holmes tilted his head slightly. "Then you save us an awkward introduction, madam. You are looking for the dead," she continued, her gaze not moving. "You always have. But tell me, Mr. Holmes, what do you plan to do when they answer?" Holmes smiled faintly. "That depends on how they reply." She pointed toward a small chair, though she herself remained standing by the window. The room was neat and simple. A narrow bed, a writing desk, a vase of dried flowers, and a single portrait on the mantelpiece. A man in a naval uniform, his expression serious but kind. Holmes's eyes flicked toward it. "Captain Elias Gower." "My husband," she said quietly. "And yes, he is dead." "Dead men seldom write letters, Mrs. Gower," Holmes said gently. "And yet one has." Her calmness broke for the first time. A tremor crossed her hands before she folded them tightly. "I knew it would come," she whispered. "I knew the river would send it back. The letter, you mean?" "All of them," she said. "I burned what I could. The rest were taken. He wrote to me before the fire to warn me. He said there were men who feared what he carried. He spoke of betrayal, of the Navy, of things I barely understood. When they told me he had drowned, I believed it. I wanted to. But the letters kept arriving, even after the funeral." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "How many?" "5, she said. "Each unsigned, but written in his hand. The last came 6 months ago. I could bear it no longer. I sent them away." "To whom?" Her eyes lifted to his with the faintest flicker of shame. "To a man who promised to make the past disappear. He called himself Mr. Graves. He said he dealt in silence." "An undertaker?" Holmes asked softly. "A tradesman of another sort," she said bitterly. "He knew the law and how to bury it. He came at night in funeral clothes and spoke with the calm of a priest. I gave him the letters, and he paid me enough to leave London. But when I tried, I could not go. Something kept me here. I think," she added, "I have been waiting for you." Holmes rose slowly and moved to the window. Outside, the afternoon fog had begun to gather again, dimming the light until her reflection shimmered beside his in the glass. "Mr. Graves," he repeated, a name that states its purpose too openly to be fake. "He trades in death, and he has made you his partner." She turned away. "I am no partner, Mr. Holmes. I am his debt." There was a pause. Holmes studied her profile, then said, "Mrs. Gower, would you let me examine your late husband's belongings, if any are left?" She hesitated, then crossed to the desk and unlocked a drawer. From it she took out a small box of polished oak. Inside lay a few keepsakes: a watch, a compass, a faded letter whose edges had browned with age. Holmes unfolded it with care. It was written in the same hand as the river letters, though the tone was gentler. "If ever truth comes for me, let it find me unarmed. Trust no uniform that glitters too brightly. And if you hear of a ship called the Argonaut, believe none of what they say." Holmes's eyes darkened as he read. "Your husband knew," he said softly. "He knew his voyage was not just to transport goods. He knew they meant to silence him." She lowered her gaze. "Then it was murder." "It was official rules, which is a slower form of it," Holmes replied grimly. "Tell me, this man, Graves, did he mention anyone by name? Any partner?" She frowned, trying to remember. "Only once. He said, 'All debts are owed to the fifth man.' I thought it was a riddle." Holmes nodded slowly. "It is the same phrase used in the letters. The fifth name, the one that commands the rest." He folded the papers and returned them to her. "Mrs. Gower, you have done nothing unforgivable, but you are not safe. If Graves learns that I have spoken with you, he will try to make sure you speak with no one else." Her calmness cracked. "Then what shall I do?" Holmes looked at her steadily. "You will stay here. Tell no one of my visit, not even your landlady. At night, keep a lamp lit in the window. It will be enough for me to know you are alive. I will find this Mr. Graves." As we took our leave, she followed us to the landing, her hand resting lightly on the railing. "Mr. Holmes," she said softly, if you find my husband's murderer, will you tell me the truth?" Holmes paused at the foot of the stairs. "If the truth serves you, madam," he said. "If not, I shall give you peace instead." We stepped once more into the street, where the air had grown heavy and the gas lamps flickered uncertainly. Holmes drew his coat close about him, his expression unreadable. "The widow has no tears," he murmured. "She has traded them for secrets." He glanced toward the east, where the river glimmered faintly between the chimneys. "Graves," he repeated, as though tasting the word. "A man who buys silence and sells despair. Tonight, Watson, we will see what the undertakers of London truly bury." The wind rose, carrying the smell of damp stone and the echo of distant bells. Somewhere a carriage passed, its wheels whispering on the wet road. And as we turned the corner, I glanced back to see the third-floor window flicker once with light, then fade as though swallowed by the growing fog. That evening, London lay under a pale and breathless fog. The gaslights struggled against it, their halos blurring into formless circles, and even the cries of the street sellers came muffled, as though the city itself was afraid to disturb the quiet. Holmes and I had taken a cab toward Kensal Green Cemetery, following the faint but steady thread that wound through every clue we had gathered: the man in funeral black, the red seal of the friar, and the letters that would not rest. Holmes had said little during the drive. His mind, I could see, was tuned to that high pitch of nearly silent focus that comes before a discovery. When at last he spoke, it was in a voice low and distant. "Our enemy hides among symbols, Watson. Death, the river, the friar's hood, all masks for a truth he fears to name. If he has chosen the graveyard for his next act, then it is because he wants an audience of the dead." The cab rattled to a stop before the wrought iron gates of Kensal Green. A light mist clung to the railings like breath on glass. Inside, the cemetery stretched in long, silent rows, statues leaning from their bases, angels worn down to nameless shapes, and tomb buildings blackened by soot and years. Holmes slipped the latch and entered, moving without sound between the tombs. I followed, the crunch of gravel under my feet sounding unnaturally loud in the vast quiet. He led us toward the older section, where the stones had begun to tilt and sink into the earth like tired guards. "Look," he said, kneeling beside a monument half swallowed by ivy. "Fresh footprints. Size 10, narrow arch, a man of height and discipline." He touched the earth and brought his fingers to his nose. "Pipe clay again, faintly colored with wax. Our undertaker has been here, perhaps within the hour." We pressed deeper into the city of the dead until the fog closed around us like gauze. Then Holmes raised his hand sharply. "Down," he hissed. A faint scrape of metal reached my ears, followed by the muffled thud of earth being moved. Through the haze, a lantern's glow trembled, a dull orange circle among the stones. A tall figure knelt beside an open grave, his face hidden by the brim of a black hat. Each movement was careful, almost respectful. He was lowering something into the hole, a small tin box glinting briefly before vanishing into shadow. Holmes's breath was barely audible. "He buries his letters," he murmured. "The dead deliver, and the dead receive." The figure straightened. For an instant, the lantern light caught his profile, thin, with a sharp nose and a mouth fixed in a faint, humorless smile. He turned the lantern on the gravestone, showing the words Elias Gower, lost at sea, 1883. I felt Holmes's hand tighten on my sleeve. "It is impossible," I whispered. "On the contrary," he replied. "It is a show, and we are its witnesses." The man replaced his hat and began to move away, his lantern swinging gently at his side. Holmes signaled me to stay still until the footsteps faded toward the southern path. Then, with cat-like quickness, he crossed the ground and knelt beside the disturbed earth. From his pocket, he drew a small folding shovel and began to dig up the box. It was light when he lifted it, but sealed with the same red wax we had come to know too well. "Another letter?" I asked. "Or something rarer," he said. "Truth, preserved." Before he could look at it, a sudden noise split the stillness, the crack of a branch followed by the echo of running feet. Holmes rose at once, his eyes flashing. "He's not gone far. This way." We gave chase through the fog, our lantern bobbing wildly. The path twisted between monuments and vaults, the shadows playing tricks on the eye. At one turn, I saw the black coat ahead, fluttering like a raven's wing. Holmes increased his pace, the graveyard wind whistling past us. Then, as suddenly as he had appeared, the figure vanished. We stopped beside a tomb building whose door hung slightly ajar. Holmes pushed it open, revealing darkness inside. "Stay close," he whispered. The air inside was cool and stale. Our lantern showed a narrow room lined with stone shelves, many of them empty. On the floor lay a scattering of papers and the faint imprint of muddy boots. Holmes stooped and picked up one of the sheets. It was a telegram form, unaddressed, but with a single phrase, "Body received, awaiting identification." "From the morgue," Holmes muttered. "He is staging the next act already." The noise behind us made me jump. A rustle like a coat brushing against stone. Holmes spun, his revolver gleaming, but the doorway was empty. Only the fog waited outside. He lowered the weapon slowly. "He plays with us, Watson. We are the prey he means to teach." We returned to the grave where the box had been found. Holmes opened it there under the whispering trees. Inside lay not letters this time, but photographs. 5 small photograph cards, their edges water-stained, their faces half-faded. Holmes spread them on the tomb. "Gower," he said, pointing to the first. "Then our widow. Then Lestrade's superior at the yard, Sir Jasper Maltravers. The fourth I do not know." He turned over the final photograph and stiffened. "And the fifth ... It was himself. Sherlock Holmes, photographed perhaps 2 years earlier, seated in profile beside a laboratory table." "Good God," I breathed. "How?" Holmes stared down at his own picture, his expression unreadable. "He has been inside Baker Street," he said at last, "within these very walls. That is my sample table. The glass on it is still cracked from last winter's experiment." He replaced the photographs carefully, his calmness restored by the act of analyzing. Our opponent collects souvenirs of his victims before he strikes. The widow, the admiral, the yard, and now myself. 5 in all. The list is complete. But what does he plan to do? "Judgment," Holmes said quietly. "He means to call each one to answer, beginning with the dead and ending with the living." The distant ringing of the church bell drifted across the graves. Holmes straightened, pocketing the tin box. "Come, Watson. The fog hides him for now, but he will surface again, and when he does, he will bring his show to the one place where death and justice talk without joking. Where is that?" He smiled faintly. "The morgue. We left the cemetery just as dawn began to thin the fog. Behind us, the graves returned to their stillness, but I could not shake the feeling that the city itself had begun to stir, like a sleeper turning uncomfortably before the nightmare begins again." As we climbed into the cab, Holmes said, "There will be another letter before nightfall. The dead are nothing if not on time." His prediction proved true. By the time we reached Baker Street, Mrs. Hudson met us at the door, pale and trembling, holding an envelope sealed in red wax. "It was brought, sir," she whispered, "by a man in black." Holmes took it gently, his eyes narrowing on the familiar mark of the friar. "Our ghost writes quickly," he said. He broke the seal and unfolded the page. "The fifth name has been written. Come to the place where truth lies coldest." Holmes folded the letter, his face unreadable in the dim light. "Watson," he said softly, "fetch your coat. We dined tonight at the morgue." We arrived at the city morgue just as twilight gave way to night. The building squatted by the river like a thinking animal, its windows dim and its stone walls gleaming with dampness. A dull yellow light glowed above the entrance, the single eye of a sleepless place. Holmes paused on the doorstep, breathing in the smell that came from inside: formalin, steel, and the faint sweetness of decay. "There are places," he murmured, "where truth and death trade their secrets by the ounce." The attendant, a pale, sickly-looking man with a habit of whispering even when no one was around, led us through a hallway lined with pale tiles that reflected the gaslight like bone. "Inspector Lestrade is waiting, gentlemen," he said softly. "Down here, last room on the right." Lestrade greeted us with his usual mix of annoyance and relief. His bowler hat lay on the table beside a large book, and his thin face looked more tired than I had ever seen it. "Holmes," he said, "I'll be glad of your opinion on this one. I'd swear London has taken to making its corpses appear out of the fog. What have you, Lestrade?" Holmes asked. He drew back the sheet from the slab. "A man pulled from the Thames at Blackfriars just before dawn. No papers, no marks to identify him, except this." He handed Holmes a small card. It was the calling card of Mr. Sherlock Holmes, consulting detective, 221B Baker Street. I saw Holmes's eyes flicker, but his expression did not change. "Where was this found?" "Tucked into the poor devil's vest," said Lestrade. "And look here." He turned back the body's arm to reveal a wrist marked with a faint circular burn, the impression of a seal pressed into the skin. Holmes bent close. "The friar again," he murmured. "A man branded with his own death." Lestrade frowned. "You know something of this, I take it." "I know," Holmes replied, "that whoever sent the letters has now added a body to his letters." The inspector crossed his arms. "You'll have to explain that, Mr. Holmes." But Holmes did not answer at once. He was studying the corpse, its long hands, the thinness of its face, the leftover black fabric that clung to its shoulders. Finally, he straightened. "A messenger, not a victim. This man delivered the letters. See the faint mark on the thumb and forefinger. A writer's callus, recent. He carried the weight of a pen more than a spade." Lestrade grunted. "He's carrying nothing now." Holmes turned to the attendant. "Were any belongings found with the body?" "A small leather pouch, sir, in the pocket." "May I?" The man got it from a drawer. Inside was a folded telegram slip, the paper damp but readable. Holmes spread it flat on the table. The message read, "The fifth name signed. Return to sender." It had no address, only the code stamp of the Central Telegraph Office. Holmes tapped it lightly. "He was called here to deliver the corpse that had my name on it." "The joke is perfect." Lestrade's face darkened. "Holmes, if this is a prank by one of your enemies, ... My enemies seldom bother with humor," Holmes interrupted. "This is art, Inspector. Sick art, but art nonetheless." He turned suddenly toward me. "Watson, you remember the photographs from the graveyard, the 5 faces. Gower, the widow, Maltravers, myself, and an unknown fourth. The same 4 names match the dead, the grieving, the authority, and the investigator. The 5th, unnamed, must be the one in charge, the one who writes from behind the curtain." Lestrade snorted. "A fine curtain it is. I'll have half the yard looking for your ghost author." "Do," said Holmes dryly. "But tell them to search not among thieves or rebels. Look instead for those who deal in official rules, the men whose hands are never clean, though they never touch blood." He took up the telegram again, holding it to the light. "Return to sender," he whispered. "A challenge, Watson. A duel fought in envelopes and corpses." Before Lestrade could reply, a noise sounded in the hallway. A flurry of footsteps, the rattle of a gurney wheel. The door burst open, and another attendant appeared, pale and breathless. "Another body, sir, just brought in from Westminster Pier. Same markings." Holmes was across the room in an instant. We followed him into the hallway, where a second shrouded form lay on a stretcher. The attendant drew back the cloth, revealing a young man, his face peaceful, almost asleep. On his wrist gleamed the red mark of the friar. Holmes examined him briefly, then reached into the man's coat pocket and pulled out a folded sheet. "A letter," he said. The seal was unbroken. He cracked it open with the edge of his thumb and read aloud, "To the one who thinks himself beyond guilt. The 5th man signs in silence. The debt will be paid in full when the fire starts again. Look under the floor where the truth was drowned." Holmes folded the letter with care. "Under the floor," he repeated. "Not water, but wood. Not river, but room." "Holmes," I said quietly, "what do you mean?" He looked at me as though through a haze of thought. "The old East India docks. The Argonaut's cargo was brought there before the fire. If a man wanted to bury a secret on land before he sank it at sea, that is where he would have done it." Lestrade frowned. "And what do you expect to find there now, after all these years?" Holmes slipped the letter into his pocket. "Whatever our Mr. Graves has not yet collected." He turned to the attendant. "Have this body kept separate. Do not, under any circumstances, release it to the undertakers. Our man likes to take back what belongs to him." As we left the morgue, the fog was rising from the river again, coiling around the lamps like pale smoke. "He is speeding up the game," he said. "He has buried his letters, dug up his messengers, and now sends his dead to carry my name. There is a method in his performance. Watson, an artist arranging his final scene. Then you believe he means to kill again? Holmes stopped and looked at me, the faint light glinting on his sharp face. I believe, he said, that he has already chosen his last person to write to. The fifth name, Watson, has been written, and it may very well be mine. He began to walk again, his steps quick and certain. Tomorrow we go to Shoreditch. There is a room there, where letters are written in ash, and a dead man's hand still guides the pen. The sound of the river followed us as we walked, slow, heavy, and unstoppable. It was the sound of London breathing in its sleep, dreaming of its crimes. Holmes did not speak again until we reached Baker Street. Then, as he went up the stairs, he paused and said in a voice that was almost gentle, "Watson, should you hear me speak with anyone tonight, anyone at all, do not answer and do not open the door." Holmes promised me. I nodded, feeling worried. He smiled faintly. "Good. The dead are very persuasive, my dear fellow, and I have no wish to be convinced." He disappeared into his room, leaving me with the uneasy knowledge that for the first time I could not tell whether the ghosts he chased were of other men or of his own making. By the following afternoon, London was humming with rumors. I could feel it in the air before we even reached Whitehall. That strange electricity that crackles whenever Sherlock Holmes's name finds its way into the city's gossip. News travels fast in London, and scandals travel even faster. A body found with Holmes's own calling card was enough to feed the city's hunger for whispers. At every street corner, under every arch of soot-stained brick, the question spread: had the great detective gone mad? When our cab pulled up before Scotland Yard, a crowd had already gathered along the railings. The evening papers were being sold by boys, whose high-pitched cries cut through the fog. The Baker Street Phantom. Dead man carries Holmes's name. Holmes paid the driver without a word and walked through the entrance like a man who had never doubted he was welcome. I followed, aware of the many eyes that turned to watch us. Inspector Lestrade met us in the hallway, his face set in that grim look which serves policemen for sympathy. "Holmes," he said, "I'd advise you to stay out of sight for a few days. You're the talk of the yard, and not in a good way." Holmes removed his hat and brushed a bit of dust from his sleeve. "Let them talk. A rumor, like a disease, is often best studied at its source." He walked past Lestrade into the records room, where two constables suddenly stopped their conversation when he arrived. Their eyes flicked away, but I had already heard the last of their words. ... And they say he planted the card himself. Holmes turned toward them with a thin smile. "Gentlemen," he said pleasantly, "I would prefer you to wait until my tombstone is carved before you practice writing it." The younger constable turned red up to his hair, mumbling an apology. Holmes moved on, his gaze scanning the shelves. "You see, Watson," he murmured, "a reputation is a delicate thing. Once it is infected, it rarely gets its former health back." Lestrade closed the door behind us. "You must understand," he said in a lower tone. "Some of the men think you've gone too far this time. 2 bodies in as many days, both marked with your name. It looks bad. The commissioner has had letters from the press already." "Then I trust he'll read them with his usual good sense," Holmes replied dryly. "Tell me, Lestrade, has there been any word from the telegraph office? Any trace of where our mysterious messages were sent from?" "None. The clerk said the order came through the night mail, a prepaid code with origins that can't be traced." Holmes smiled faintly. "Excellent. A man who hides his footsteps invites us to study where he stood still." Lestrade stared. "Meaning ... Meaning," Holmes said, "that our target must use one office repeatedly. He avoids variety. He believes repetition is a disguise." Such men always do. He pulled a folded scrap of paper from his pocket and placed it on the table. This, Watson, is the schedule of telegram deliveries from the Central Telegraph Office on the nights the bodies appeared. You will notice the timing. I leaned closer. Each date matched the hour of discovery, almost exactly, the bodies arriving just as the last telegram was sent. He sends his message before he kills, I said. Holmes nodded. A ritual, perhaps. Each act of violence is a letter sent to himself. Proof that he exists. Lestrade muttered, You're describing a madman. Holmes's eyes gleamed. A poet, Inspector, a poet who writes in corpses. He moved to the window overlooking the yard's courtyard. Beyond the railings, a group of reporters waited like birds that eat dead things. One called up, bold as anything. Mr. Holmes, is it true you're under investigation? Holmes raised the window an inch, just enough for his voice to carry. Gentlemen, he said calmly, I am always under investigation. The difficulty is in proving who is doing the investigating. A ripple of laughter and unease passed through the crowd below. Holmes closed the window. They shall make a ghost of me before the case ends, he said. And perhaps that is exactly what our enemy wants, to turn me into the ghost he pretends to call up. Lestrade sighed. Holmes, if you're right, then you'll have half of London chasing your shadow, and no one after the killer. That will suit him perfectly, said Holmes. A murderer who works through mirrors cannot stand the light. He crossed to the file drawers, pulled out one marked, Admiralty, Confidential Correspondence, 1883, and opened it with a key he took from his pocket. I thought so, he murmured. The Argonaut inquiry. Note the initials here, EGCGJM and PD? Lestrade peered over his shoulder. Who's PD? Holmes's expression grew distant. Philip Darnell, chief clerk of naval records in that year. He was quietly fired for taking documents, though no charges were ever brought. He vanished soon after. You think he's our man? Holmes closed the file. I think he has been dead to the world for 7 years, long enough for the world to forget his handwriting. He replaced the folder and turned sharply to Lestrade. I need a favor. Do not release any statement about the body at the morgue. Let the press believe I'm under suspicion. Let the city whisper. Lestrade blinked. Why? Because our poet writes for an audience, Holmes said. If he believes his play is succeeding, he will reveal his next act. Pride, Inspector, is the only witness that never lies for itself. He reached for his hat and motioned to me. Come, Watson. We must call on a chemist in Shoreditch who is interested in strange and morbid things. I suspect he knows where ink meets ash. As we stepped out into the courtyard, the reporters rushed forward, shouting questions. Holmes did not slow down. The lamps cast long streaks of gold across the wet stones, and I found myself struggling to match his pace. You plan to use yourself as bait, I said under my breath. He smiled faintly. Bait, my dear Watson, is only dangerous when it forgets the hook. At that moment, a small boy darted from the shadows, one of Holmes's street helpers, and pressed a crumpled envelope into his hand before vanishing again. Holmes tore it open as we walked. Inside was a scrap of gray paper, the writing shaky but unmistakable. They talk of you at the yard. They will soon speak of you at the coroner's. The fifth man waits beneath the floor. Holmes slipped it into his pocket. He listens even here. The walls have ears, and some of them write letters. He glanced toward the river, where fog was rising once more in slow, deliberate coils. Tonight, he said, the play moves to Shoreditch. The stage is ready, and our friar waits for his confession. The cab turned eastward, the city sliding past in ripples of gaslight and smoke. Behind us, the great building of Scotland Yard sank into shadow, and the whispers of London followed like an echo that refused to die. The fog that evening hung low over the East End, like a veil drawn by a careless hand. It softened the lamps to dull yellow coins and turned the narrow streets of Shoreditch into a maze of wavering shapes and uncertain sounds. The further east we went, the less London looked like itself. The air grew heavy with the scent of cold smoke, cheap gin, and machinery, the restless pulse of a district that never truly slept. Our cab stopped before a decaying pharmacy shop, whose windows were crusted with the dirt of decades. The faded lettering above the door read, Mortimer and Sons, Sellers of Remedies and Tonics. Holmes paid the driver and stood for a long moment studying the warped door. "Notice, Watson," he said. "A shop of the living that smells like the dead. The perfect place for our man to work in peace." We entered quietly. The shop was empty, except for the lingering smell of iodine and camphor. Dust lay thick on the counter, disturbed only by the circular mark of a recently placed jar. Behind it, a stairway went down into darkness. Holmes drew his revolver. "Keep your light ready," he murmured. We went down into a narrow cellar. The walls were lined with shelves crowded with bottles, whose labels had long since peeled away. At the far end, a heavy oak door stood bolted. Holmes ran his fingers along its frame and found a narrow slit barely wider than a blade. "Locked from within," he said softly, "and sealed, by the smell of it, with wax." He produced a thin strip of metal from his pocket and began to work the lock. The sound of the lock parts was faint but clear. "Our friend is fond of dramatic touches," Holmes whispered. "The friar's seal, the letters, the graves. But this, Watson, is no longer a show. This is a confession." With a click, the bolt slid back. The door creaked open, releasing a breath of air so cold it put out the flame of my lantern. I struck a match, and its light showed the strangest room I had ever seen. The walls were covered with hundreds of sheets of fancy paper, each covered in writing. Letters, drawings, pieces of sentences, some in ink, some in charcoal. A table stood in the center, cluttered with bottles of dark liquid, a microscope, and what looked like ashes, spread carefully on white plates. Above it hung a gas lamp, whose glass was stained red, and in the chair before the table sat a man, motionless, upright, his eyes open and glassy. Holmes approached cautiously, then bent to examine him. "Dead," he said, almost gently. "For at least 2 days." The man was middle-aged, thin, with a narrow face and long fingers stained blue-black by chemicals. On his chest was pinned a small piece of parchment with the words, "I have written enough." Holmes's gaze swept the room. "Philip Darnell," he said, "the missing Admiralty clerk, the man who tried to drown a secret and instead taught it to swim." He moved to the table and examined one of the plates. On it lay what was left of burnt paper mixed with some fine gray dust. "Ink made from the dead," he murmured. "Human ash mixed with iron gall." He believed he could give a voice to silence itself. The thought made my skin crawl. Then these letters were written from the remains of those he wronged. "Yes," Holmes said. "Each message a rebirth, each seal a lesson. This man was no simple murderer, Watson. He was a chemist of guilt." He picked up one of the sheets from the wall. The handwriting was faint, trembling. "I write for those who cannot. The 5th name was mine before it was his. Forgive my show, for the audience was deaf." Holmes folded the paper carefully and placed it in his pocket. "There will be no forgiveness in this," he said. "Only the truth, and perhaps a bit of pity." A sudden noise broke the silence. A footstep above, light but deliberate. Holmes's eyes flashed. "We are not alone." He put out the lamp, plunging us into darkness. The floorboards creaked faintly overhead. Then a voice, soft, almost like conversation, floated down the stairwell. "So, Mr. Holmes, you've come to read my script." The voice was calm, measured, and creepily familiar. Holmes did not answer. The steps came down slowly, one by one, until a figure appeared in the doorway. He wore the same black coat, the same graveyard hat we had seen at Kensal Green. In his right hand, he held a revolver. In his left, a small lantern whose dim flame painted his face in wavering gold. It was a face I recognized from the photographs. The thin messenger we had seen buried at Blackfriars, alive and smiling. "Mr. Graves, I presume," said Holmes evenly. The man tilted his head. "A name like any other. We all dig our own graves in the end." He stepped closer, the barrel of the gun gleaming. "You've followed the trail as I planned. You've read my letters, opened my coffins, and woken my ghosts. Tell me, Holmes, how does it feel to be the final page?" Holmes's voice was steady. "You mistake me for a reader, sir. I am only an editor." Graves's smile widened. "Then edit this." He fired. The sound was deafening in the small space. The shot struck the lamp, shattering it into darkness. I heard Holmes move, as fast as a striking snake. There was a struggle, the sound of a body hitting the floor, then silence. When I lit a match, Graves lay motionless, the revolver beside him. Holmes stood above him, his own weapon still smoking faintly. "Alive?" I asked. "For the moment," Holmes replied. "Fetch the constable who waits above. Tell him we have found both murderer and victim in one body." As I turned to go, Holmes's voice stopped me. "Watson," he said softly, "look there." On the table beside Graves's fallen hand lay another letter, freshly sealed in red wax. Holmes picked it up and broke the seal. "To Sherlock Holmes. The fifth man is cleared. The river will keep what I cannot. Burn this room, or it will write again." Holmes stared at it for a long moment, then placed it gently into the flame of my match. The paper curled, blackened, and was gone. He looked around the room one last time, at the papers, the ashes, the silent man who had written with the dead, and his expression softened into something that might almost have been sadness. "He killed to protect his secret," he said quietly, "and died to ensure its silence. Perhaps he was the aeonly honest man among them." We left the cellar as the first glow of dawn touched the streets of Shoreditch. Behind us, the pharmacy's windows flickered as Holmes struck a final match and tossed it through the door. The flame caught at once, a faint bloom of orange in the gray light. Holmes watched without expression as smoke began to rise. "Come, Watson," he said at last. The dead had finished speaking, but as we turned away, a gust of wind caught the ashes inside and scattered them across the street. I could not help but think that somewhere among them, words still lingered, half-formed, waiting for another hand to write them again. By the time we returned to Baker Street, the fire from Shoreditch had already begun its whispered change into rumor. The morning papers spoke of a mad chemist's suicide, a secret Navy experiment, and a gruesome discovery linked to the consulting detective. Holmes read each headline with that special calm, which for him took the place of sleep. His pipe lay cold on the mantelpiece, untouched. The light from the window was colorless, heavy with smoke drifting from the east. I, Watson, had seen him in many moods, excited with discovery, tired from doing nothing, and once or twice in the grip of despair's narrow shadow. But never had I seen him so still, as if thought itself had reached the end of its rope. The ashes from Shoreditch were still on his cuffs. At last he spoke. "I have spent the night looking at the pieces we saved." Among the papers saved from the fire was a half-burned receipt. It has the stamp of the harbour-master's office at Woolwich, dated the week before the Argonaut sailed. The cargo item is missing, yet the initials P.D. appear again in the margin. Darnell did not destroy the letters at sea, Watson. He shipped them. He rose and crossed to the window. The river hides all crimes eventually, but not forever. Graves called himself the fifth man. That was false humility. There was a sixth, one who drowned before his confession could be heard. And now, he added softly, the drowned man wishes to speak. He turned suddenly. Fetch your coat. We go to Woolwich. The day was wet, a slow, miserable drizzle that seemed to rot the color from the world. The Thames followed us like a ghostly companion, its surface filled with oil and mist. At Woolwich, the air smelled of tar and salt, and the memory of ships. Holmes led the way to the harbor-master's office, a low brick building whose inside was cluttered from a century of paperwork, logbooks, maps, and the muffled ticking of a wall clock. The clerk, a gentle fellow with watery eyes, looked up as we entered. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Holmes laid the charred receipt on the counter. "I would like to know who approved this shipment on board the Argonaut. Registry 4812, June of 1883. The clerk adjusted his glasses and peered down. "Ah, difficult. That year's logs were moved to storage after the fire." "Then you will get them," said Holmes in a tone so polite it was terrifying. Within minutes the clerk returned, carrying a thick leather-bound book. He flipped through until Holmes's finger stopped him. There, written in faded ink, was the entry. Shipment, private letters, 5 crates. Authority, Darnell. Philip. Witnessed, E. Gower, Captain. Holmes tapped the page. 5 crates, Watson. 5 men, 5 letters. He built his guilt into the very math of the crime. The clerk coughed apologetically. "There is a note in the margin, sir. To be transferred upon arrival to Maltravers. J. That name appears again in the records of return." "Sir Jasper Maltravers," Holmes said grimly. The yard's own whispering ghost. A man of law who preferred his laws unwritten. He closed the logbook with a snap. Darnell burned the letters, but Maltravers buried the truth. The question remains, who ordered the fire on board the Argonaut? For that, we must speak with the only man left who might have known. The only man? I repeated. But Gower ... Exactly. That night we took a small hired boat from Blackwall Reach and drifted slowly along the river toward the spot where the Argonaut had gone down. The wind came off the water in long, sad sighs. Holmes stood at the front, his coat collar drawn high, his profile sharp against the gray space. He held a sealed jar in one hand. "Darnell's final experiment," he said. "Ink and ash drawn from human remains." I wondered what he meant by his last line. "The river will keep what I cannot." It seems he meant this. He uncorked the jar and let its contents fall into the water. The dark cloud spread like smoke under the surface, dissolving slowly. "Baptism," he murmured. Or perhaps an invitation. Then he knelt, plunging his hand into the water. "Hold the lantern here." At first, I thought he was trying some scientific test, but as the light trembled over the surface, I saw something that chilled me. A shape drifted just under the ripples, a pale oval, with no features but unmistakably human. It turned once in the current, and I saw the outline of a face. Holmes caught his breath sharply. "Elias Gower," he said. We hauled the body to shore with the help of the boatman. Though water-soaked and horrifying, the face was recognizable from the portrait in Mrs. Gower's room. The hands were folded neatly across the chest, tied by a strip of black ribbon. Tucked under it was an envelope sealed in red wax. Holmes broke it open. Inside was a single page, its ink barely readable. "They drowned me because I knew the 5th name. Maltravers ordered it. Darnell obeyed. Graves delivered. But one man watched and did nothing. He read the truth and burned it. Forgive me, Holmes." Holmes stared at the page for a long time, his face unreadable. "He speaks of me," he said at last. I stepped closer. Surely not. Yes, he said quietly. Years ago, I chose not to expose the Navy scandal. I believed silence would prevent further ruin. I see now that silence, like the river, only deepens what it covers. He folded the letter and placed it carefully into his coat. Watson, we are not hunting a murderer. We are finishing a confession. Gower wrote his last words not to blame me, but to free himself. The fifth man was the conscience I refused to keep. We carried the body to the nearest constable station and left it in their care. Holmes gave no name. He simply said, "A sailor returned home." As we walked back along the riverbank, the tide rising behind us, Holmes spoke again softly. Maltravers must now be made to answer. The man has hidden behind honor long enough. Graves's death, Darnell's madness, the widow's sorrow, all trace back to one act of cowardice wrapped in a uniform. He paused beside the river wall and looked down at the slow black water. I shall not make that mistake again. I laid a hand on his shoulder. Holmes, the past is not yours to punish. He looked up, and there was a strange light in his eyes. You are wrong, my dear fellow. The past is the only criminal that never dies. It must be tried again each day. We reached Baker Street near dawn. Holmes went directly to his desk, drew out a sheet of paper, and began to write. The scratch of his pen was the only sound in the room. When at last he finished, he sealed the letter and placed it beside the others on the mantelpiece. For the Yard, he said simply. It contains what remains of the truth. Lestrade will know what to do. He turned toward the window, where the first weak light was creeping through the fog. Watson, I believe I have heard my own judgment. And though I longed to ask what he meant, I did not, for the look on his face was that of a man who has walked too long beside ghosts and no longer fears their company. The river murmured distantly through the open window, carrying away its secrets once more. The dawn that broke on London that morning seemed tired from its own arrival. The fog had pulled back into the alleyways, leaving the streets slick with its leftovers. A pale light crept across Baker Street, touching the curtains, the half-burned fireplace, and at last the figure of Sherlock Holmes, seated without moving by the window. He had not slept. The remains of the night's tobacco still smoked faintly in the air, mixing with the damp scent that always followed a night of rain. I rose and poured him a cup of tea, though he did not seem to notice. The letter he had written for Lestrade lay on the mantelpiece, its wax seal unbroken, the single word confession written across the front in his hand. For an hour he sat like that, the silence broken only by the ticking of the clock and the distant clatter of a milk cart on the cobblestones below. Then, without looking up, he said, You see now, Watson, what a proud thing truth can be. The dead wanted it, and it killed them. The living protect it, and it eats them up in turn. I had no answer. The events of the past few days seemed to hang about us like the smoke from a fire not yet put out. Gower, Darnell, Graves, all turned to ashes and rumor. And yet the story was not quite finished. A knock sounded at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered shyly, a telegram in her hand. Holmes took it without a word. His eyes moved across the lines. Then he handed it to me. Maltravers found dead this morning in his rooms. Apparent suicide. Lestrade requests your immediate presence. Yard. Holmes leaned back in his chair and breathed out slowly. The fifth man has signed in silence, he murmured. We reached Scotland Yard shortly after 8 o'clock. The hallways buzzed with the quiet excitement that comes with a scandal among one's own people. Lestrade met us outside the commissioner's office, his expression serious, but not surprised. You were right, Holmes. Maltravers left no note, but this was found on his desk. He handed over a small sealed envelope marked, To the Detective. Holmes slid it open with his penknife. Inside lay a single sheet of paper, blank except for one line. The debt is paid. He folded it and returned it to Lestrade. Then the account is closed, he said quietly. Lestrade studied him a moment. You don't look as if you feel much satisfaction in it. Holmes gave a faint, tired smile. Justice seldom pays back with extra, Inspector. It merely balances the books. We left without any fuss. Outside the morning had grown brighter, though the air remained heavy, as if the city itself were holding its breath. Holmes hailed a cab, and we rode in silence toward the river. When we reached the riverbank, he dismissed the driver and began to walk along the stone wall, his coat flaring slightly in the breeze. "Watson," he said at last, "do you remember Gower's words?" "Forgive me, Holmes." Yes, he believed that by speaking he was blaming me. He was mistaken. He cleared me. I thought reason could silence conscience, but I see now the two are not enemies. They are partners in the same investigation. He stopped beside a railing and looked down at the slow, putty-colored water. For years, I've been proud of myself for bringing order where others saw only chaos. Yet every solution, no matter how exact, leaves behind some leftover piece, a grief, a rumor, a shadow that logic cannot get rid of. This case simply made the leftovers visible. I laid a hand on his arm. You did what had to be done. He smiled faintly. Yes, but not what should have been. For a long moment he watched the current, the sunlight trembling on it like nervous handwriting. Then, without turning, he said, "Watson, go home. Send the Yard my good wishes, and tell them the case is finished. There is nothing more to be learned here. Holmes ... He raised a hand. "Please, I would like a moment alone." There was something in his tone that stopped any argument. I left him there on the riverbank, his tall figure motionless against the morning light. By the time I reached the carriage stand and turned back, the fog had risen again from the water, and he was gone. I searched for him the rest of that day, but he did not return to Baker Street. Lestrade sent men to the river's edge, to the docks, to every inn and lodging-house between Westminster and Limehouse, yet found no trace. The only discovery was made that evening, when a constable found a single violin bough floating near Blackfriars Bridge. For 3 days, I kept the fire burning and his chair empty, as though warmth might bring him back. On the 4th, a letter arrived, delivered by hand, but with no return address. The handwriting was his. "My dear Watson, do not search. The river remembers its own, and I am happy to let it keep me a while. Should the world grow dull without its ghosts, you may tell it I have gone to investigate them personally. Whatever else is written of me, let it be said that I left my deductions unfinished by choice, not by failure. The last letter has been delivered. S.H." I read those words until the ink seemed to fade under my eyes. Whether he had truly gone to the river that morning, or just vanished into some quieter life away from everyone, I never learned. But I have often thought that if ever the Thames should part its mists at dawn, one might see him there. A dark shape against the water, watching the city wake. A cigarette burning between his fingers. The ghost of a violin tune lingering in the air. In the years that followed, London moved on. The papers forgot their scandal, the Yard their embarrassment. The widow of Gower disappeared into the countryside. Of the letters, none survived except one. A white envelope kept in my drawer, its message still readable after all this time. "You failed me once, Mr. Holmes. Do not fail me again." Sometimes on mornings when the fog is thick enough to blur the lamps of Baker Street into halos, I imagine I hear a footstep on the stair and the creak of a familiar chair settling by the fireplace. Then I remember that Holmes, even when gone, never truly leaves. He just moves on to the next case, the one beyond the reach of reason. And so ends the case of the letters from the dead, an investigation that began with an impossible envelope and ended in silence. The fog remains, the river flows, and somewhere in their depths lies the man who taught even death to write. The game, I think, will never truly be over.